On Father's Day, his daughter-in-law Melissa humiliated him in front of more than 100 guests, screaming for him to get out and stay in the kitchen like a useless old man. The room fell silent. Whispers and smirks cut deeper than knives, and the man who had woken at dawn to cook every dish was treated like a servant in his own home. He stood, frozen dignity ripped away, but inside something cold began to form a decision that would change everything. What he planned next would shock them all. Subscribe for more and comment with your city or even just a number. The plate exploded against the tile, a violent crash that swallowed every voice in the room. The laughter, the chatter, the clinking of silverware, all of it stopped. Dozens of eyes locked on him, wide shocked, some even gleeful. The turkey he had basted for hours lay smeared across the floor, potatoes splattered like an insult, gravy crawling in thin lines over the cracked porcelain. His son's wife, Melissa, stood over him with a crooked smile, the kind that dared anyone to challenge her version of events. The silence was suffocating, a silence that carried the weight of every humiliation he had endured since moving under their roof. Neighbors shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Church friends whispered behind polite hands, their sympathy sharp and hollow. Old co-workers from a lifetime of labor looked away, ashamed to see a man once known for his strength crouched on the ground, fingers trembling as he picked shards of china out of gravy. His cheeks burned with fire. The ache in his knees was nothing compared to the sting of being reduced to a spectacle, a living reminder of how easily respect can be stripped away. Melissa's voice cut through the silence, sharp as a whip. "Look what you've done," she sneered, her tone dripping with false outrage, as if he had ruined her perfect performance. Her words carried across the hall, searing into every guest's memory. He kept his head down, swallowing the shame like poison. Every scrape of ceramic against tile felt like an indictment. The crowd began to recover, conversations trickling back, but the tone was different now, softer, coated with the awkward pity reserved for tragedies best ignored. Jonathan, his son, sat frozen at the head of the table, torn between loyalty and blindness. He raised his glass, forced a smile, and let Melissa's lie stand. The father's chest tightened. This was not the boy he had raised with calloused hands and endless sacrifices. This was a man blinded by the illusion of a perfect marriage, too weak to shield his own father from cruelty. As he gathered the last broken piece, he saw his reflection in it, a distorted face, weary, lined with years of labor. A man who had built homes, paid bills, carried burdens so his son could rise. Now he was on the ground, reduced to rubble like the plate he held. The guests turned away, their avoidance louder than any insult. That was the cruelty of shame. Not just the mockery, but the silence, the refusal to meet his eyes, the collective agreement that he had been diminished. Melissa turned her back on him, laughter rising in her throat as if nothing had happened. Her white dress shimmered under the chandelier, the expensive fabric glowing, while his dignity bled into the cracks of the tile. She clinked glasses with the guests, accepting their empty praise while he remained invisible, nothing more than the shadow in his own home. But inside, behind the stillness of his weathered face, something colder than rage began to settle. Humiliation has a strange way of hardening resolve. Each whisper, each turned glance, each smug smile was a brick laid in the foundation of something he hadn't allowed himself to build for years. His hand, steady now, slid the broken shards into his palm, cutting the skin. He didn't flinch. Pain was temporary. Memory was permanent. When the food was gone and the floor wiped clean, he stood alone in the kitchen. The noise of the party swelled back into existence beyond the swinging doors. Music, toasts, the sound of Melissa's crystalline laughter echoing like glass about to break. He washed his hands slowly, the water turning faintly pink where the cuts bled. He dried them on a towel, hung it neatly, and looked out through the narrow crack in the door. His son leaned close to Melissa, her hand on his shoulder, whispering words that made him smile. The father's stomach turned not with weakness, but with certainty. For 5 years he had endured this theater, convinced that tolerance was a form of love. He had swallowed insult after insult, believing that silence preserved peace. But peace built on humiliation is no peace at all, it is a prison. Tonight the bars had become visible, and once a prisoner sees the bars, escape is inevitable. He left the kitchen and moved through the hallway, unseen, unheard. He passed the photographs lining the wall. His son's graduation, the day Jonathan bought his first car. The memory of a boy who once looked up at his father as if he were indestructible. Now that boy sat across the table from a woman who saw him as nothing more than a paycheck, a pawn, a source of endless control. In his small room upstairs, the noise of the party became muffled, distant. He opened the drawer of his desk and removed an envelope, its weight heavy with the years he had sacrificed. $40,000 saved dollar by dollar, withholding comforts scraping from a pension that barely stretched far enough. He had planned to gift it to Melissa, thinking money might soften her cruelty. Tonight he knew better. Money would not silence her. Money was the language she spoke, but truth was the weapon she could never withstand. He placed the envelope on the desk, then reached behind the spice jars in the kitchen cabinet, pulling out the second envelope. Smaller, lighter, yet far more dangerous. Inside were photographs sharp and undeniable. Melissa with Ryan, his son's so-called best friend, embracing in the shadows of a hotel parking lot. Their lips locked, their bodies pressed close, their betrayal documented in the flash of a camera he had held steady despite the tremor of his hands. He had waited. He had watched. He had gathered evidence with the patience of a man who had built entire homes brick by brick. Now the foundation of Melissa's lies stood before him, and he knew exactly how to bring it down. Downstairs, the clink of glasses marked the start of a toast. He heard Melissa's voice ringing with triumph, praising family, loyalty, devotion, all the words she had poisoned with her deceit. The guests laughed, lifted their glasses high, blind to the rot that pulsed beneath the surface. He looked at the photograph again. His son's best friend. His son's wife. Betrayal layered upon betrayal, stacked like cards in a house destined to fall. He slipped the photo back into the envelope and slid it into his jacket pocket. His reflection in the mirror was no longer that of a broken man. It was the face of a father who had decided enough was enough. What happened on that floor would not be forgotten. The shame, the whispers, the silence, they were the spark. What came next would be the fire. And when it began to burn, there would be no mistaking who lit the match. He had risen before the sun, the old clock in the hallway striking 5, as he shuffled into the kitchen with aching knees and fingers that barely bent anymore. The air was cool, the silence broken only by the click of the oven knob and the hiss of the gas flame catching. He rubbed the stiffness from his hands, flexed them against the ache, then bent over the heavy bird he had marinated overnight. The turkey was lowered into the oven, its weight straining his wrists, but he held steady. For hours he peeled potatoes, diced onions, simmered gravy, and kneaded dough until the counters were dusted with flour. Every motion was deliberate, guided not by habit but by memory, decades of holidays, when his son's eyes lit up at the smell of roast turkey and the first bite of his favorite pie. By mid-morning the kitchen glowed with heat. Steam clouded the windows, the scent of butter and spices heavy in the air. He moved like a craftsman, steady and slow, never once complaining, though the arthritis burned up his arms. This was what he knew. What he had always done: provide, prepare, sacrifice. He remembered the years when Jonathan was young, when money was tight, and overtime hours at the construction site stretched into nights. Still, he had always managed to scrape together enough for a holiday meal, even if it meant skipping meals himself the week before. Sacrifice wasn't new. Sacrifice was survival. When Melissa swept in near noon, dressed in a white suit that probably cost more than his monthly pension, she didn't smell the turkey roasting or notice the pie cooling on the counter. She wrinkled her nose, making a face as if the scent of his work offended her. "Don't ruin the meat with too much salt again," she said casually, not even looking at him. "My friends expect better." Her words sliced clean without effort, as if he were nothing but the hired help. He swallowed the bitterness and nodded, knowing silence was the only shield he had left. He thought of the years after his wife's passing when Jonathan insisted he move in so he wouldn't be alone. It was supposed to be comfort, family, safety. Instead, it had become a slow erasure, one humiliation at a time. Melissa had claimed the house with her sharp heels and sharper tongue, turning his presence into an inconvenience. He worked harder than ever to earn a place in his own son's life, cooking, fixing, patching, doing the chores no one else noticed, while she accepted compliments for a home she never lifted a finger to maintain. The guests began to arrive in the afternoon, their voices swelling in the living room. He heard Melissa's laugh ring out high and rehearse, soaking in the praise. What a wonderful hostess, they told her, marveling at the immaculate house and the spread of food that was his alone to labor over. He stood hidden behind swinging doors, sweat running down his backhands raw from hours of scrubbing and chopping. Each compliment aimed at her struck him like a nail hammered deeper into wood. He was the ghost in the kitchen, invisible, yet the one carrying it all. When he finally set the platters on the table, golden turkey, steaming potatoes, glistening vegetables, it should have been a triumph. Instead, it was as though he'd delivered tribute at the feet of a queen. Melissa took the glory, nodding graciously at the applause, her hand brushing Jonathan's shoulder as if she had given him everything. Jonathan smiled, pride in his eyes, never once glancing toward the man whose sweat flavored every bite. The father sat at the edge of the room with his own plate, the pie, waiting for dessert, its crust baked to perfection just as Jonathan had liked it since childhood. He should have felt pride, but the applause left him hollow. Every ache in his hands reminded him that the love he baked into that pie was invisible to everyone but him. Sacrifice had become a currency nobody valued anymore. He remembered working double shifts to pay for Jonathan's college, coming home with blistered palms and still managing to cook dinner. He remembered selling his tools to cover the down payment on Jonathan's first house. He remembered slipping extra bills into Jonathan's wallet when he was newly married, and struggling, always telling him it was nothing, that fathers were supposed to do that. Every memory was a scar, and each scar was proof of love. But here in this house that used to be his sanctuary, those scars meant nothing. Melissa raised her glass, leading a toast, her voice smooth and triumphant. "To family," she said, and laughter filled the room. He stared at her, the words like venom in his ears. Family. She had twisted the meaning, turned it into a weapon, and no one else seemed to notice. He looked at Jonathan, beaming at her side, blind to the performance. For a moment he wondered if his sacrifices had built a man too trusting, too willing to hand over his loyalty to someone who only saw him as a fool. The pie sat untouched, waiting, a symbol of devotion ignored. He thought of the hours it had taken to roll the crust just right, to blend the filling until it was smooth. He thought of Jonathan as a boy, sneaking slices from the cooling rack crumbs trailing down the hallway. That memory, sweet and warm, clashed with the cold truth in front of him. His son had grown, but the respect, the gratitude, the recognition of everything that had been given it had not followed. As the laughter swelled and Melissa accepted more praise, he sat still, his eyes locked on the pie. The sweetness was there waiting, but he tasted only bitterness. Sacrifice without acknowledgement is not love. It is servitude. He had carried that burden willingly for years, believing love required it. But tonight, under the chandelier's glow and the hum of voices that didn't see him, the truth sharpened. Sacrifice meant nothing to those who refused to see it. He pressed his fork into the crust, the sound sharp in his ears. He took a bite and the taste was ash. Across the table, Melissa leaned into Jonathan's ear, whispering something that made him laugh. The father's jaw tightened. Every bite they took from the feast he had built was another reminder of how invisible he had become. The food filled their stomachs, but the sacrifices that created it dissolved into silence. He rose quietly, carrying his plate back toward the kitchen. The pie remained untouched on the counter, a symbol of devotion ignored. His hands, stiff and scarred, rested on the edge of the sink as he looked out into the dark yard. The night pressed against the window, heavy, endless. The laughter behind him grew louder, as if mocking his silence. Sacrifice had been his language, his legacy. Tonight it had been ignored, erased, discarded as if it were nothing. But he knew better. He knew sacrifice was more than food on a table or dollars slipped into a wallet. Sacrifice was power when wielded at the right moment, and he had already begun to plan how to turn every sacrifice they had ignored into a weapon they would never forget. The word cut through the air like a blade, cruel and deliberate, echoing against the chandelier-lit ceiling until it seemed to hang above the entire room. Useless old man. She had chosen her moment carefully, her voice pitched just loud enough to make sure every guest heard it. Forks paused mid-air, glasses froze halfway to lips, and the weight of silence crushed the air around him. The father stood there, the plate trembling in his hands, his ears burning with the echo of her insult. He felt the stares of neighbors, friends, even church elders he had known for decades. Their pity was worse than the words themselves. Melissa's smile was sharp, her eyes daring him to respond, to break the facade she had so carefully built. Her pearls gleamed at her throat, her posture perfect like a queen scolding a servant. She hadn't just mocked him. She had stripped him bare, reducing him from father and builder of this home to an old relic, something to be dismissed. And Jonathan, his son, his pride, his reason for rising before dawn and working his body into ruin, sat there frozen, his silence screaming louder than any defense could have. He didn't rise. He didn't protest. He let her words stain the air without resistance. The father's chest tightened to pressure like stone settling behind his ribs. He had faced foremen shouting orders on construction sites, storms tearing through rooftops. He had built nights of hunger when money barely stretched far enough to cover his boys' school fees. None of those battles had left him feeling this small. Shame clawed at him, burrowing deep into the marrow of his bones. His son's silence carved deeper than Melissa's cruelty. Melissa's friends exchanged glances, some amused, some pretending not to notice. One of the neighbors smirked behind his glass of wine, enjoying the spectacle. Church acquaintances shifted uncomfortably, unwilling to intervene. That was the cruelty of public rejection, not just the insult itself, but the way it invited others to witness, to silently approve by their inaction. Every second stretched heavy with humiliation. The father lowered his gaze not because he was defeated, but because the storm building inside him was too dangerous to unleash in that moment. He bent to pick up the fallen fork, his hand steady now, the sting of the insult already transforming into something else, something colder, sharper. The laughter resumed slowly, awkward at first, then louder, as the party tried to move past the scene, brushing it off as nothing more than a moment of tension. But the damage was done. The words couldn't be unsaid. Melissa leaned close to Jonathan, whispering something that made him force a smile. To the guests it looked like a wife soothing her husband. To the father it was another knife in the back. He saw the way Jonathan's eyes avoided his, the way he chose blindness over confrontation. It wasn't just Melissa's betrayal. It was his son's complicity, even if born of weakness. The bond they had built through decades of sacrifice now trembled, fragile, threatened by the grip of a woman who wielded cruelty as casually as she lifted a glass of wine. He returned to the kitchen, but the humiliation followed him like a shadow. He stood at the counter, staring at the pie he had baked with love, and thought of the words again. Useless old man. They rang in his ears, louder than the laughter from the dining room, louder than the clinking glasses. He gripped the edge of the counter until his knuckles whitened. The insult was not just an attack on his age, it was an erasure of his life, his work, his worth. He remembered the nights he carried Jonathan on his shoulders when the boy was too tired to walk home from school. He remembered fixing bikes in the garage, teaching him how to swing a hammer, how to measure twice and cut once. He remembered the look of pride in his son's eyes the day he graduated, when he shook his father's hand and whispered, "Thank you." That boy was gone, hidden beneath the weight of Melissa's manipulation. What remained was a man who couldn't or wouldn't stand for his father in his hour of shame. The father's reflection in the darkened window stared back at him. Wrinkled skin, tired eyes, lines carved by years of sacrifice. Yet in that reflection he also saw the steel that had carried him through a lifetime of storms. He wasn't useless. He wasn't old in the way she meant. He was still the man who had built every wall around them, who had poured the concrete foundation beneath their feet, who had made this family possible. Melissa's cruelty couldn't erase that truth. But Jonathan's silence, his failure to defend, was a wound that would not heal easily. The party roared louder now, Melissa's voice carrying above the others as she told some story designed to draw more admiration. The father listened, his eyes narrowing. She had won the moment, basked in her petty triumph. But moments are fragile things, and hers would not last. He had learned long ago that storms don't announce themselves with thunder, they gather quietly and visibly until the first strike rips the sky apart. He sat at the small kitchen table, the envelope of money and the hidden photographs still tucked away upstairs. His fingers tapped against the wood, steady, patient. He could have risen then, exposed her in front of them all. He could have shattered her illusion with a single photograph. But no, the timing had to be perfect. A single moment of cruelty could not be repaid with a rush of anger. It demanded precision, patience, calculation. He imagined the look on her face when the mask cracked, when Jonathan saw the truth with his own eyes. He imagined the silence then, not of pity, but of shock, as her lies crumbled and her empire of manipulation collapsed. That silence would not shame him, it would crown him with vindication. He sipped his water slowly, letting the bitterness settle into something sharper, something useful. The night dragged on, the guests laughing, the music swelling, Melissa glowing in the center of it all. Jonathan raised another toast, his voice unsteady, but his smile loyal to the woman who had just humiliated his father. The father watched from the shadows of the kitchen doorway, his expression calm, now unreadable. To anyone looking, he was beaten, quiet, invisible. But beneath the surface, the fire had already been lit. Humiliation, he knew, was fuel. And fuel, when gathered carefully enough, always finds its spark. What Melissa didn't understand was that her cruelty had done more than wound him. It had awakened him. And when the time came, she would learn that the man she called useless was still capable of building and destroying with the same steady hands. The guests clapped again, the sound swelling like applause at the end of a performance. Melissa bowed her head slightly, gracious and false. Jonathan kissed her cheek, blind and grateful. And the father, standing alone in the shadows, allowed himself the faintest of smiles. Her stage was bright tonight, but he knew the curtain always falls. What she didn't see was that he had already begun writing the ending, and when it arrived, no one in that room would ever forget it. The kitchen tile pressed icy against his knees, but he barely felt it. His hands lingered on the damp cloth, sweeping away the last traces of the shattered plate, though the humiliation would never be wiped clean. He stayed low to the ground, hunched like a man begging for forgiveness, but there was no apology in him anymore. There was only silence. And in that silence, something began to calcify. 5 years of biting his tongue, 5 years of playing the obedient shadow in his own son's home, 5 years of sacrifices that dissolved into invisibility. Every insult, every dismissal, every smirk Melissa had flung at him now fused together into a single unyielding weight. It pressed down on him not to crush him, but to forge him into something harder, colder, unbreakable. The party roared on beyond the kitchen doors, oblivious to the shift that had just taken place. Melissa's voice rang out in laughter, high and triumphant, as if her cruelty had been nothing more than a witty anecdote. Jonathan's softer murmur followed the sound of a man trying to please, trying to keep peace, blind to the cracks widening beneath his feet. The father rose slowly, his knees stiff, his hands braced against the counter as he pulled himself upright. When he stood, his back straightened higher than it had in years. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like a burden. He felt like a storm gathering its strength. He moved to the sink and washed his hands again, letting the cold water sting the small cuts in his skin. The sting grounded him, reminded him of what he still possessed, the endurance of a body that had worked through pain, the willpower of a man who had built houses with his bare hands, the patience of someone who had learned long ago that some victories take years to ripen. He dried his hands carefully, folded the towel, and placed it neatly on the rack. Even in the smallest act there was precision, control, intention. The memory of the last 5 years replayed in fragments, Melissa taking control of the household, rearranging his wife's old furniture without a word of respect. Jonathan urging him to just let it go, to give her time. Neighbors praising Melissa's hosting while he stood in the background, unacknowledged. Each memory cut, but tonight, instead of bleeding, he felt them crystallize into armor. They no longer hurt. They empowered. He sat at the small kitchen table, the hum of voices seeping through the door, muffled but incessant. He looked at the pie on the counter, untouched, the crust golden and perfect, the air still carrying its sweet scent. It wasn't just dessert. It was years of love baked into a single dish. And yet in this house, under her rule, it was nothing but decoration for her to claim credit for. He leaned back in the chair, his breath slow, measured. She thought she had humiliated him into silence, but she had done the opposite. She had given him clarity. He thought of Jonathan, the boy who once ran barefoot in the yard, chasing fireflies, shouting with joy. That boy had looked at his father with trust so deep it had once been unshakable. But the man at that dining table had let love blind him. The father's jaw tightened. He wasn't angry at Jonathan, he was disappointed, and disappointment cut deeper than rage. Melissa had stolen his son's sight, his strength, his loyalty. That was the true betrayal, and that was where he would strike. The murmur of voices grew louder, the clinking of glasses announcing another toast. He imagined Melissa raising her glass, her painted smile dazzling the room, speaking words about family and unity she did not mean. He didn't need to see it to know how it played out. He had witnessed enough of her theater to predict every move. But what she didn't know, what no one in that room knew, was that the curtain had already begun to fall. He rose from the table and walked to the narrow hallway where the family photos lined the wall. His eyes scanned them slowly. Jonathan's graduation, the wedding day, birthdays frozen in still images, all moments where he had been present, where his sacrifices had laid the foundation for smiles and celebrations. Yet as he stared, he realized Melissa's presence had seeped into those memories too, her shadow darkening even the brightest ones. He clenched his fists, then forced them open. Anger could not guide him. Strategy had to. Back in his room upstairs, he opened the drawer where the envelope lay waiting. The money was still there, but it no longer represented sacrifice. It was leverage. He lifted it, felt its weight, then placed it beside the smaller envelope, tucked deep in the back. The photographs. The evidence. Proof of Melissa's duplicity. Her betrayal, her carefully constructed lies. He ran his fingers over the envelope, the edges sharp beneath his skin. Tonight was not the night to use them. Not yet, but soon. Timing would be everything. He closed the drawer and sat on the edge of his bed. The sounds of celebration below drifted upward, hollow and mocking. His reflection in the mirror across the room caught his eye. For years he had seen a man diminished, a man whose worth was measured only in what he could give and not in who he was. But tonight he saw something else resolve. The lines in his face, the gray in his hair, the stiffness in his joints, none of it made him useless. It made him enduring. It made him dangerous. The night dragged on, laughter and music swirling together until it became little more than background noise. He lay back on the bed, fully dressed, staring at the ceiling fan spinning above. His thoughts moved with it. Steady, controlled, circling the plan already taking shape. He would not lash out. He would not scream. That was what Melissa expected, what she wanted to prove him: unstable, weak, pathetic. No, his revenge would be quiet, deliberate, and devastating. When the last guest left and the house settled into uneasy silence, he still did not sleep. He listened to the faint footsteps upstairs, the creak of doors closing, Melissa's laughter carrying one last time as she retreated to her room. He closed his eyes, but his mind remained sharp, alive with the knowledge that her cruelty had lit a fuse. She thought she had broken him. She thought she had won. But he knew better. He had not broken. He had awakened, and the next move would be his, delivered not with rage but with precision, in a way that would leave her scrambling in the ruins of her own arrogance. He had waited 5 years for this moment, and now he could wait a little longer. The silence that followed was not defeat. It was the sound of a man preparing for war. He climbed the stairs slowly, each step creaking beneath his weight, though his mind was far heavier than his body. The house was still alive with the remnants of laughter and clinking glasses, but up here, away from the glow of chandeliers and Melissa's performance, there was only darkness. He opened the door to his room, a space that had once felt like refuge but now resembled a cell. The dresser stood against the wall, its top bare except for a lamp and an old photograph of Jonathan as a boy smiling in a baseball uniform. He barely glanced at it. His focus was on the second drawer, the one he had lined with false papers and junk to make it seem unimportant. He pulled it open with steady hands and retrieved the envelope. It was thick edges, soft from being handled so often, weighty with the years of sacrifice it represented. $40,000. He had denied himself vacations, new clothes, even a proper car, choosing instead to squirrel away every extra bill he could manage. At first he had imagined giving it to Melissa, thinking a gesture of generosity might thaw her contempt. Perhaps money would soften her tongue, earn him the sliver of respect she withheld so easily. But tonight, standing in the quiet glow of the lamp, he understood the truth with final clarity. Melissa would never see a cent of it. Her greed did not deserve reward. It demanded punishment. He placed the envelope on the desk and stared at it, the weight of his decision pressing against him like an anchor and a liberation all at once. Then slowly his gaze shifted to the corner of the room, where an old shoebox rested on the floor hidden beneath blankets. He pulled it free, removed the lid, and took out the smaller envelope. This one did not hold money. It held photographs. Proof. He had begun collecting them months ago, the first time he'd suspected Melissa's late-night excuses and unexplained errands were more than what she told Jonathan. He had followed her, once a shadow trailing her to a downtown hotel. The camera, in his shaking hands, had captured her entering with Ryan, Jonathan's so-called best friend. The images were clear, her lips on Ryan's, her arms wrapped tightly around him in the glow of a street lamp. He laid the photos across the desk, the lamplight sharpening every detail. Her betrayal was undeniable, and he had more than enough to tear her mask apart. Yet even as he studied them, his mind stretched further. An affair was ugly, yes, but Melissa's hunger for money, her sharpness when discussing Jonathan's finances, had always unsettled him, so he had begun digging deeper. Bank statements arrived in the mail when Jonathan wasn't home. Papers Melissa always intercepted first, but he had learned to slip in early to catch a glimpse before she could hide them. Transfers, withdrawals, expenses that didn't make sense. Thousands siphoned away from Jonathan's accounts into destinations that smelled of secrecy. Through contacts he still had from his years of work, men who owed him favors, he discovered even more. Melissa's name wasn't always Melissa. She had been Carmen Alvarez once, and before that Marissa Hill. Each name linked to men left hollowed out savings, drained property, signed over reputations ruined. She was a predator, and Jonathan was just her latest victim. The realization had nearly broken him, but now it fueled him. She thought she was clever, that her lies stitched together a perfect disguise, but she had underestimated him. She had forgotten that a builder knows how to see the flaws in a structure long before anyone else notices the cracks. He gathered the photos, the copies of bank statements, the notes he had written in his careful hand. He slid them into a fresh folder, one that would be harder to ignore. Each page was a weapon, each fact a blade waiting to be drawn. The $40,000 would serve another purpose now, not as a gift, but as leverage, a fund to ensure her downfall unfolded with precision. Downstairs the party dwindled. He heard the shuffle of feet as guests left, coats lifted from hangers, doors opening and closing. Melissa's voice floated up the stairs, light and charming, as she bid farewell to those who had just hours earlier witnessed her cruelty. She was winning in their eyes, maintaining her spotless facade. Jonathan's voice followed, softer, apologetic, as if thanking them for overlooking the tension. The father stood at the window of his room, watching the taillights fade into the night. He knew this was how she survived, by deceiving, by dazzling, by convincing everyone around her that she was untouchable. But he also knew something she didn't. She wasn't untouchable. Not anymore. He sat back at the desk, slid the folder closed, and placed it beneath the envelope of money. Together, they looked almost ordinary, two bundles of paper stacked neatly, but in his mind, they were dynamite. The trick would be choosing the exact moment to light the fuse. A reckless reveal would only scatter ashes. But a carefully timed detonation at the dinner table, perhaps, or in front of those very guests who had once laughed at him, would bring her empire crashing down. He imagined the silence, then the whispers turning on her instead of him. Jonathan staring at her in disbelief as the world she built collapsed in on itself. That vision sustained him. He leaned back, closed his eyes, and allowed himself one deep breath. It was not relief, not yet. Relief would come only when Melissa's mask shattered, when her cruelty returned to her multiplied. For now, it was only resolve. The years of humiliation had led to this point. The envelope in his drawer was no longer a symbol of sacrifice. It was the key to her undoing. The night crept on. Melissa's laughter drifted once more from downstairs before fading into silence. The house grew still, but he remained awake, his mind alive with calculation. He had what he needed, and soon she would know what it felt like to kneel on a cold floor with the world watching, stripped of dignity, exposed for what she truly was. And that moment, he promised himself, was coming. The city hummed around him that night, neon lights flickering across rain-slick streets, traffic rolling like a restless tide. He stood in the shadows across from the hotel, collar turned up against the chill camera clenched in his hand. He had followed her for weeks, each late-night errand and vague excuse leading him deeper into suspicion, until tonight the truth finally emerged from the dark. Melissa stepped out of a black car, heels clicking against the pavement, her white coat cinched tightly at the waist. She looked over her shoulder, once cautious, before striding to the side entrance where Ryan waited. Jonathan's best friend, the boy who had once sat at his kitchen table eating pie and calling him sir, now stood with hunger in his eyes. The father raised the camera, breath steady, and clicked. The flash didn't betray him. He had prepared for this, learned where to stand, how to let the streetlights illuminate the scene without drawing attention. He watched as Melissa melted into Ryan's arms, their embrace long and shameless. Another click. Her lips met Ryan's, careless and passionate, a kiss meant for a man who was not her husband. Click. Each frame captured betrayal in its purest form, a gallery of deceit that no excuse could erase. He should have felt anger, the kind that claws through the chest and blinds reason, but instead he felt something far more dangerous: clarity. It wasn't only that Melissa mocked him, treated him like a servant in front of strangers. It was that she mocked Jonathan too, weaving lies into their marriage, eroding his son's trust with every secret touch, every stolen night. She wasn't just cruel, she was faithless. And she believed no one saw. He lowered the camera, the leather strap warm against his palm. The photos were proof, but more than that, they were power. He turned away before they disappeared into the hotel, his mind already racing. Jonathan was blind, wrapped around Melissa's finger, and Ryan was the knife twisting deeper into his back. The betrayal ran in two directions, cutting both father and son, but the blade would not stay hidden much longer. On the walk back to his car, the city noise blurred around him. Horns blared, laughter spilled from bars, but all he could hear was the echo of Melissa's voice from that night in the dining room. Useless old man. Now he saw the full picture. She wasn't just stripping away his dignity. She was dismantling his son's life piece by piece. The humiliation had been a diversion, a way to keep him small and silent, while she orchestrated something far more destructive. At home, he spread the photographs across his desk. The lamplight painted harsh shadows over Melissa's smile, frozen in deceit, Ryan's hands clutching her waist. He studied each image carefully, committing them to memory. Every detail mattered: the time stamped at the corner, the hotel sign glowing above them, the angle of their embrace. Together they told a story that could not be denied. But he wasn't ready to reveal it yet. Timing was everything. To show Jonathan now would be to risk disbelief, Anger redirected toward the messenger instead of the guilty. No, the truth needed to be unveiled in a way that shattered the illusion, completely leaving Melissa no room to twist the narrative. He had learned patience on construction sites, waiting for concrete to cure, for steel beams to lock into place. He could wait a little longer here too. Still, the betrayal gnawed at him. He thought back to Ryan as a teenager, sitting at their kitchen table laughing with Jonathan over homework. He had bought the boy pizza, driven him to ball games, patched up scraped knees after rough practices. Ryan had been like family, a second son in all but name. To see him now hand in hand with Melissa was a wound that went deeper than he cared to admit. He imagined Jonathan's face when he finally saw the photos. The devastation, the disbelief, the collapse of trust in both his wife and his best friend. It would break him. The father's chest tightened, not out of pity but out of sorrow for the boy who had once looked at him like a hero. He wanted to shield him from the pain, but shielding had allowed Melissa to thrive. This time exposure was the only path to salvation. The following days, Melissa moved about the house as though nothing had happened. Her cruelty sharpened her charm, unblemished in front of others. She kissed Jonathan's cheek in the morning, whispered in his ear at night, all while her phone buzzed with messages she thought no one noticed. He watched her carefully, noting every glance, every smirk, every absence she couldn't quite explain. Each act of deception layered upon the last, until the evidence in his folder was no longer just proof, it was a weapon waiting for the right strike. Ryan, too, became bolder. He visited the house more often, laughing with Jonathan in the living room while stealing glances at Melissa when he thought no one saw. The father saw it all. He felt it burn in his chest like embers waiting for flame. And each time he caught Ryan's smug smile, he tightened his grip on the secret he held. At night he lay awake, listening to the hum of the ceiling fan, the memory of the hotel kiss playing on repeat. The images were seared into his mind, but they didn't torment him, they steadied him. Because he knew that soon, Melissa's arrogance and Ryan's betrayal would collapse under the weight of truth. He imagined the night it would happen. The table set, the guests gathered, Melissa raising a glass with her false smile. Jonathan at her side, blind and loyal. And then the folder opened slowly, photographs sliding across the table like a hand of cards no one could refute. Gasps, silence, Jonathan's eyes widening as the foundation of his marriage split apart in front of everyone. Melissa's mask slipping, Ryan exposed the applause and admiration she had stolen, turning to disgust. That night in the city had given him more than evidence. It had given him purpose. And as he slid the photographs back into the envelope, sealing them tight, he knew the betrayal was no longer hidden in shadows. It was waiting in his drawer, patient, ready to burn everything down the moment he chose. What Melissa didn't know was that her cruelest insult had not broken him. It had given him the clarity to watch, to document, to prepare. She thought her secrets were safe in the dark, but he had already dragged them into the light. And when the moment came, there would be no escape. The report arrived in a plain envelope slipped under his door, as though it were nothing more than junk mail. But when he opened it, when the pages fanned across his desk beneath the lamplight, the truth bled out in black ink and photographs. Melissa was not Melissa at all. Her birth certificate, her old driver's license, the trail of names she had worn and shed like snakeskin, they all told the same story. Carmen Alvarez. A name heavy with history, a name connected to vanished husbands, drained bank accounts, and men who had been left in ruins. He read slowly, each page a knife twisting deeper. She had walked this road before, perfected it over years. Marriage as a mask, charm as a weapon, bank transfers hidden through shell accounts. Men who thought they had found love only to discover they had been nothing but prey. One in Miami, another in Denver, a third in Phoenix, each with the same pattern. Sudden romance, fast marriage, financial entanglement, then devastation. She was not merely unfaithful. She was a predator who hunted in plain sight. The photographs showed her younger hairstyle differently. Eyes always the same, sharp, calculating. In one she stood with a man twice her age smiling like a dutiful wife, while his hand rested proudly on her shoulder. A year later he filed for bankruptcy. In another she leaned against a car with out-of-state plates, a ring glittering on her finger. The caption beneath it noted the man's inheritance had disappeared within months. The father set the photo down carefully, bile rising in his throat. But the most sickening page was the bank records. Transfers traced from Jonathan's accounts tens of thousands at a time, siphoned so subtly that he had never noticed. $250,000 gone, funneled into names and addresses that led nowhere. His son worked long hours believing he was building a future with his wife, while she gutted him from the inside out. The father's hands shook as he gripped the edges of the report. It was no longer just betrayal, it was theft, on a scale that could destroy his son completely. He leaned back in his chair, the weight of years pressing down on him. All the sacrifices he had made, the endless hours, the sleepless nights, every dollar earned with sweat and blood, they had all been for Jonathan to have a better life. And now that life was being hollowed out by a woman who had mastered the art of predation. His jaw clenched until it ached. She had chosen the wrong family this time. He thought back to the night Melissa Carmen had called him a useless old man. He replayed it now with this new knowledge. The insult was no longer just cruelty. It was a tactic. Keep him small, keep him humiliated, keep him powerless so he wouldn't see what she was really doing. She had underestimated him. She thought age meant blindness. She thought silence meant weakness. But he had built a life on paying attention to the smallest cracks before they became collapse. And now he saw her clearly. The investigator had added a final note written in neat block letters. She will not stop, not until there is nothing left. The father closed the folder slowly, his reflection in the window hardening. He had endured humiliation, betrayal, shame. But this was war. She wasn't merely poisoning his son's marriage. She was stealing his legacy, dismantling everything he had fought to give Jonathan. If she succeeded, Jonathan would be left not only broken-hearted, but bankrupt, his future strangled before it could take shape. The father walked to the dresser and pulled out the envelope of money, laying it beside the report. $40,000 in cash ready for the right moment. But now he understood that the money alone wouldn't be enough. She was too practiced, too slippery. This would require more than confrontation. It would require strategy, patience, exposure so complete that no amount of lies could cover it. He imagined her face when Jonathan saw the truth. The photos, the documents, the evidence stacked against her. He imagined her composure shattering her charm, crumbling the room, turning against her the way it had once turned against him. That vision was no longer just satisfying, it was necessary. But even as he mapped the plan in his mind, he felt something colder settle inside him. This wasn't only about justice for himself anymore. It was about protecting Jonathan from a woman who had marked him like prey. It was about cutting out the infection before it consumed everything. His silence had allowed her to thrive. Now his action would destroy her. Downstairs he could hear Melissa's laugh again, drifting through the vents. That laugh that sounded sweet to strangers but rang hollow to him now. It was the laugh of a predator who believed she was safe. He closed the folder, slid it back into the drawer, and pressed his palm against the wood. The decision was made. Carmen Alvarez thought she had written this story, thought she controlled every page, but the father knew better. She had left behind a trail, and he now held the ending in his hands. And when it came, it would not just expose her, it would end her reign forever. The dining room glittered with false warmth, candlelight flickering against polished silverware, the hum of voices weaving into a fabric of comfort that wasn't real. He stood in the doorway unseen for a moment, his eyes scanning the table where Melissa reigned at the head like a queen. She wore emerald green that evening, a dress that caught the light with every movement, her smile wide and triumphant as she lifted her glass. To family she declared her voice smooth and commanding, filling the room with a lie so grand it almost sounded believable. Almost. The father stepped forward, steady, deliberate, his shoes silent against the hardwood floor. The room seemed to sense him before anyone noticed the conversation faltering as he approached. Melissa's smile wavered just slightly, but she recovered quickly, holding her glass higher. Jonathan glanced at his father, confusion flashing in his eyes, but he didn't move. The father stopped beside her, close enough to smell the faint perfume she wore, the kind that tried to mask rot with roses. He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew the envelope. Thick, heavy. A lifetime of silence bound in paper. He set it in front of her without a word. The sound of it hitting the table was louder than any toast. Melissa's fingers froze around the stem of her glass, her knuckles whitening as the weight of it settled in front of her. "What is this?" she asked, her tone forced casual, but her voice cracked like porcelain under strain. "Open it," he said, calm, his voice cutting through the air sharper than a blade. The guest shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting between husband and wife, between father and son. Melissa's bravado faltered as she slid a manicured nail under the flap and pulled the contents free. Photographs spilled across the linen tablecloth, her arms wrapped around Ryan in the neon glow of a hotel sign, her lips pressed to his, their betrayal frozen in undeniable clarity. Alongside them, documents printed in stark black ink, bank records, aliases, marriage certificates under false names, evidence of theft traced in neat, merciless lines. The silence that followed was not ordinary silence. It was suffocating, crushing, the kind that left no escape. Jonathan's hand resting on the table went rigid. His eyes fell on the photographs. First disbelief slicing through him like lightning. Then he moved to the papers, his lips parting, the color draining from his face as the truth unfurled before him. Melissa tried to speak, tried to form words, but nothing came. The lies that had once flowed so easily now caught in her throat, strangling her. The father remained standing, his posture unshaken, his gaze fixed on her. He had waited years for this moment, not for applause, not for pity, but for the unmasking. To strip her the way she had stripped him, to take from her the illusion she had wielded like a weapon. Every whisper of the guests, every gasp, every shifting glance at the evidence on the table was fuel. This was her reckoning, and he was its architect. Jonathan finally looked at her, his eyes no longer soft, no longer blinded. They were shattered, sharp, filled with betrayal so deep it hollowed him out. "Melissa," he whispered, though it sounded more like a curse than a name. She reached for him, desperate, but he recoiled, his chair scraping violently against the floor as he stood. The sound rang out like judgment itself. The guests, frozen at first, began to murmur. Some covered their mouths. Others leaned closer to see the damning photographs spread between the wine glasses and the half-eaten plates. Melissa scrambled, her hands shaking as she tried to gather the papers, to hide them, to stuff the evidence back into the envelope, but the damage was irreversible. The truth was laid bare, and no hand could sweep it away. The father stepped back, giving her space, not as mercy, but as finality. He didn't need to say more. The document spoke louder than any speech could. He turned his eyes to Jonathan, who stood trembling, his chest heaving as though the ground itself had betrayed him. The boy he had raised was gone in that moment, replaced by a man stripped raw by truth. Melissa's voice finally broke through, high and frantic. "They're fake. All of them. He's lying. Can't you see? He's jealous. He wants to destroy us." But the desperation in her tone betrayed her. It was the sound of a cornered predator, teeth bared but powerless against the trap closing around her. Jonathan picked up a photograph with unsteady hands, studied it in silence, then let it fall. It landed face up. Melissa's lips pressed against Ryan's in a kiss that couldn't be explained away. His jaw clenched, his eyes glistening with rage and grief. The father could see it, the recognition, the collapse, the hollowing out of trust. Melissa tried again, her words tumbling over themselves, but every denial rang hollow. The guests no longer looked at her with admiration. They looked at her with disgust, with the recognition that they had been played, that they had toasted lies and praised a fraud. Her world, built on charm and manipulation, crumbled in real time before everyone's eyes. The father let the silence stretch, savoring the weight of it. It wasn't joy, he felt, it was justice. For every insult, every humiliation, every dollar stolen, every ounce of dignity stripped away, this moment was the answer. He didn't smile, didn't gloat. He simply stood as the architect of her downfall, steady and unmovable, while she drowned in the evidence of her own making. The room had shifted. Power no longer radiated from Melissa. It radiated from him. For years she had painted him as weak, as expendable, as useless. But here, in front of family, friends, and neighbors, he stood as the one who held the truth, the one who tore the mask away. Melissa sank into her chair, her face pale, her hands trembling as she tried to catch her breath. Jonathan's eyes never left her, rage and sorrow colliding in silence. The father placed a steady hand on his son's shoulder, not to comfort, not yet, but to remind him that the truth was finally in the open. The guests began to excuse themselves, their polite exits sharp with judgment, leaving Melissa to face the wreckage she had created. The father remained unflinching, the folder now empty on the table, its contents scattered like shards of glass. When the last guest left, the house was heavy with silence again, but this silence was different. It wasn't humiliation this time. It was victory, hard won and undeniable. And though the night was over, he knew it was only the beginning. Because what collapsed in that dining room was not just Melissa's facade, it was the foundation of everything she had built. And tomorrow, when the dust settled, there would be nothing left for her to hide behind. Melissa collapsed against the polished hardwood, her glass of wine shattering beside her, red liquid bleeding into the cracks like spilled blood. The room smelled of smoke from the extinguished candles and the sour tang of exposed lies. She tried to gather the papers, her fingers frantic, but they slipped from her hands, fluttering around her like dead leaves. Jonathan's chest heaved as he looked down at her. The woman he had once believed was his anchor, now revealed as the storm that had hollowed his life. His trembling hand reached for the table to steady himself. His eyes shifted to his father, wide, desperate, searching for something solid in the ruins of everything he thought he knew. "Dad." His voice broke the word, sounding younger than he had in years. "How long have you known?" The father's throat tightened, but he did not look away. His gaze held his son steady and unwavering, even as tears blurred the edges of his vision. He had imagined this moment countless times, wondered if Jonathan would despise him for waiting, for holding the truth in silence. But now, seeing the devastation in his son's eyes, he understood why patience had been necessary. If he had spoken too soon, Jonathan would have defended her. If he had pushed too hard, the truth would have shattered without sticking. Tonight there was no denying. Tonight Jonathan saw with his own eyes. "I've known for months," he said, his voice quiet, almost tender, yet edged with steel. "But I waited. I waited for the moment when you could see her for who she really is. I did it to protect you." Jonathan's face twisted, torn between rage and grief. His fists clenched, veins rising in his arms as the photographs on the table mocked him with their cruel honesty. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came, only a hoarse sound that broke into silence. His eyes glistened, his lips trembled, and for the first time in years he looked at his father, not with impatience or indifference, but with recognition. The father placed a hand on Jonathan's shoulder, steady grounding. "I didn't do this to humiliate her," he said, his voice low but resonant, filling the room with a power that came not from anger, but from truth. "I did it to defend you, to remind you that you're worth more than the lies she fed you, and to remind myself that I am not useless, not powerless. I am still your father." Jonathan swallowed hard, his shoulders trembling beneath his father's touch. He nodded once, barely, but it was enough. Enough to tell the father that the bond, though bruised, was not broken. Enough to prove that the years of sacrifice, the endless humiliations, had not been in vain. Melissa let out a strangled sob, curling on the floor, muttering excuses that sounded more like confessions. The guests were gone, the audience dispersed, but the echo of their judgment still hung in the air like smoke after a fire. She tried to rise, but Jonathan's eyes cut through her, and she froze. The power she had wielded so effortlessly for years had vanished. Her reign had ended. The father straightened shoulders, square his breath deep and steady. For the first time in years he felt the weight lift, the weight of invisibility, of silence, of being dismissed as a relic. That night dignity returned to him, not because he had destroyed Melissa, but because he had reclaimed himself. He stood taller, his reflection in the darkened window, no longer that of a broken man, but of a sentinel who had defended his legacy. Jonathan sank into a chair, burying his face in his hands. The father stood beside him, not speaking, not pressing, just present. Sometimes presence was the greatest gift a man could give, and tonight his presence was the anchor Jonathan needed. Minutes passed in silence, broken only by Melissa's shallow breaths and the distant hum of the city outside. Finally, Jonathan lifted his head, his face pale, eyes bloodshot. "I should have seen it," he whispered. His voice cracked thick with regret. "You couldn't," the father said firmly. "She made sure you wouldn't. She built walls of lies around you. That's what predators do. But now the walls are gone, and you're free to see her clearly." The words hung in the air, heavy with truth. Jonathan nodded again, this time with more force, as if anchoring himself to the clarity that had finally pierced the fog. Melissa tried one last plea, her voice breaking as she reached for Jonathan's hand. "I love you. You know that?" Jonathan pulled away his chair, scraping hard against the floor. His glare was icy, his voice sharper than it had ever been. "No. You loved what you could take from me. And now it's over." Her sobbing grew louder, but it no longer mattered. Her power was gone, her mask shattered. The father exhaled slowly, his hand still on Jonathan's shoulder. He had waited years to feel this quiet strength, this sense of standing tall after being bent for too long. Power had returned, not in the form of vengeance, but in the form of protection. He had defended his son, and in doing so, he had defended himself. The room, once filled with the hollow sound of laughter and false toasts, now throbbed with silence. But in that silence there was something new, dignity restored and unshakable. The father knew the road ahead would not be easy. Jonathan would grieve, would rage, would feel the sting of betrayal long after the documents were locked away. But the truth was out, and truth was the only soil strong enough to rebuild upon. As the night pressed on, the father remained steady, watching over his son, like he had when Jonathan was a child, sleeping beside a sickbed, guarding against nightmares. Except tonight the nightmare was real, and it had been defeated. He looked once more at Melissa, crumpled on the floor, her sobs fading into silence, and then at Jonathan, whose eyes still burned with the rawness of betrayal. For the first time in years, the father felt whole. He had waited, endured, suffered, but in the end he had acted not with fury, but with purpose. And though the night of reckoning had ended, he knew this was not the final chapter. This was only the beginning of a new story, one where dignity would never again be surrendered, and where truth would always eventually find its way to light. Life has a way of testing our strength, not in the storms we see coming, but in the betrayals we never expected from those closest to us. The story of a father reclaiming his dignity is not just about revenge. It's about resilience, patience, and the courage to stand tall even after years of humiliation. For older adults, it reminds us that age does not erase wisdom or power. On the contrary, it sharpens them. Protecting families sometimes means facing painful truths and refusing to let deception continue unchecked. Silence may feel like peace for a time, but true peace only comes when truth is allowed to breathe. This story is a call to remember that self-worth is never defined by others' cruelty, and that dignity, once reclaimed, can inspire future generations to value honesty and respect. If this story touched you, take a moment to reflect on your own strength, your own dignity, and the lessons you've carried through life. Share your thoughts in the comments, whether it's a number, your city, or a word that captures how you feel. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that speak to the heart and remind us all of the power of truth.